Picture a world map, but one with huge blank spaces over the oceans. Spaces literally labeled, "Here be monsters." I mean, that was the reality back in the 15th century. But then, in just a few decades, a handful of incredibly daring voyages would start filling in those blanks, connecting continents, building empires, and completely redrawing the world as we know it. We're going to dive into exactly how that unbelievable transformation happened.
So you have to ask, right? Why? What could possibly convince someone to sail off the edge of the known world, risking absolutely everything? That is the question at the heart of this entire era. Was it for God, for glory, for gold? Well, the answer is a complicated mix of all three, and it's an answer that would set the entire world on a brand new course.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down in this explainer. First, we'll get into the motivations, the why. Then we'll look at the amazing new technology that made it all possible. After that, we'll follow the intense, high-stakes race between the two biggest players. And finally, we'll grapple with the world-shattering consequences of it all.
So let's jump into part one. Why leave home? And this wasn't just about a thirst for adventure. It was really about solving a huge problem that had pretty much brought European trade to a grinding halt.
It really boils down to four powerful drivers. The big one, the most urgent one, was trade. Spices from the east were worth a fortune, but the land routes were controlled by hostile empires, making everything insanely expensive. That economic pressure was the fuel, and that, in turn, fed right into a fierce competition for power. Spain and Portugal were desperate for the gold, land, and wealth that new territories could bring. And weaving through all of that was religion, this powerful, genuine desire to spread Christianity across the globe. And bubbling under the surface of it all was the new Renaissance spirit itself, a pure sense of adventure and just a burning curiosity to see what was over the horizon.
But look, motivation alone can't get you across an ocean. For centuries, these were just dreams, because the technology, it just wasn't there yet. So now, in part two, we're going to look at the revolutionary tools that finally turned those impossible dreams into reality.
And right at the heart of this tech revolution was a new kind of ship. Everybody, meet the Caravel. This thing was basically the spaceship of its day, no joke.
It was just this perfect hybrid vessel designed specifically to tackle the massive challenges of speed and control out on the open ocean.
So what made the Caravel such a big deal? Well, it was all about its brilliant design. It combined a few key features that made it the perfect ship for exploring. First, it had these triangular Latin sails, which were a total game changer because they let the ship zigzag against the wind. Then, it had huge square sails for when the wind was at its back, giving it incredible speed. The hull was clinker built, meaning the wooden planks overlapped, which made it super strong, but still flexible enough to handle rough Atlantic storms. Throw in a large rudder that made it easy to steer, and you finally had a ship that could actually conquer the unknown.
Of course, an amazing ship doesn't do you much good if you have no idea where you're going. That's where new navigational tools became so critical. The compass, for the first time, gave sailors a reliable sense of direction no matter what. And then you had instruments like the astrolabe, which were these brilliant devices that let them figure out their latitude, how far north or south they were, just by measuring the angle of the sun or the stars.
And you can add the quadrant to that list too. Put it all together and you have this toolkit that gave navigators the confidence to finally leave the safety of the coastline behind and really head out into the great unknown.
And here's a cool little tidbit. This technology is still with us in our language. Ever wonder why a ship's speed is measured in knots? It literally comes from a rope with knots tied in it. They'd toss a log overboard attached to the rope and count how many knots went by in a certain amount of time. Even the phrase, swinging the lead, that comes from sailors dropping a lead weight on a line to measure how deep the water was.
So, okay, the motivation is there, the technology is finally ready. The stage was set for part 3, an absolutely epic, high-stakes race between Europe's two naval superpowers, Portugal and Spain, to see who could claim the riches of the East first.
Now, the Portuguese, they played the long game. Their strategy was slow, it was methodical, and it was championed by this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator. For decades, he funded these grueling expeditions that painstakingly mapped the African coast, pushing just a little bit further south with every single voyage. Finally, in 1487, Bartholomew Diaz has the huge breakthrough. He rounds the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. And a decade later, Vasco da Gama finishes the job, sailing all the way to India and securing that priceless sea route to the east.
And when you look at a map from that time, you really get a sense of what they were doing.
I mean, they were literally tracing the edge of the known world, bit by bit, all the way around Africa. It was this massive generational project, built on the idea that the safest path forward was the one you could see. But then, along comes a sailor from Genoa named Christopher Columbus, and he has a much more radical and, a lot of people thought frankly, crazy idea. While Portugal was inching its way east, Columbus believed he could get to the exact same place by just sailing west, straight across the open Atlantic. He took his wild idea to Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and they decided to roll the dice and fund his trip. So in August of 1492, Columbus sets sail. After a super tense 33 days at sea, they finally spot land. He'd reached an island he named San Salvador, but, and this is a really crucial point, Columbus was absolutely convinced he had landed in the East Indies, somewhere near China or Japan. So he called the native people he met Indians, a historical mistake that has had consequences that have echoed for centuries.
The final undeniable proof of this new world came from Ferdinand Magellan. He was Portuguese, but he sailed for Spain on a mission to finally do what Columbus couldn't, find that westward path to the Spice Islands. Now, Magellan himself was actually killed along the way, but one of his ships, against all odds, made it all the way back to Spain in 1522. It was the first time anyone had ever circumnavigated the entire globe.
I mean, think about that. In just 30 years, from 1492 to 1522, the entire world had been connected by sea. But connecting the world and conquering it, well, those are two very different things. So in our final section, we have to look at the profound and often brutal consequences of this new reality. The first consequence was political, and it happened fast. Just 2 years after Columbus got back, Spain and Portugal signed this thing called the Treaty of Tordesillas. They literally drew a line down a map of the Atlantic and said, okay, Spain gets all the new non-Christian lands to the west, and Portugal gets everything to the east. Just like that, they divided up a world they had barely even begun to understand. And with those claims, of course, came conquest. Spanish soldiers, who became known as conquistadors, set out to take control of these new lands. A guy named Hernán Cortés, with only about 500 men, managed to bring down the entire Aztec Empire. And Francisco Pizarro, hearing rumors of gold, did the exact same thing to the massive Inca Empire in Peru.
For the native peoples of the Americas, the impact was just catastrophic. We're talking about the destruction of entire civilizations, their cities, their languages, their religions, just wiped out. Millions were enslaved. And maybe the most devastating weapon of all was invisible: European diseases like smallpox, which the native populations had zero immunity to, caused death on an unimaginable scale.
For Europe, however, it was a completely different story. Spain and Portugal became fantastically wealthy from the gold and silver they shipped out of the Americas. Their economies boomed, fueled by a system of slave labor. And a wave of new goods flooded into Europe, changing its culture forever. Things we don't even think about today, like potatoes, tobacco, and chocolate.
It is really hard to overstate how big of a deal this whole era was. The famous economist Adam Smith would later write that these voyages were, and I quote, "the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind." He argued they set the stage for the entire modern world.
And that leaves us with one final thought. These voyages didn't just add new lands to the map, they drew the first lines of a new global order, lines of power, of wealth, and of conflict. So the next time you look at a world map, just ask yourself, how many of the borders, the languages, the divisions we see today were first sketched out by the wake of a 15th century ship?